At 6:47 on the evening of December 17th, 1944, Private First Class William Soderman crouched alone in a foxhole at the Lousdale Crossroads near Rocherath, Belgium, watching five shapes emerge from the fog 300 yards down the road. 32 years old, former butcher from West Haven, Connecticut. Zero confirmed tank kills. The shapes grew larger. The grinding of tracks on frozen earth reached him before he could make out the details. Then the silhouettes sharpened. Sloped frontal armor, long-barreled 75-millimeter guns, the distinctive curved mantlet that American soldiers had learned to fear. Panther tanks, 5 of them, rolling straight toward his position in a column that stretched back into the gray December murk. Soderman's assistant gunner had been evacuated 2 hours earlier. A shell fragment had torn through the man's arm during the artillery barrage that preceded the German advance. The medics had carried him away on a stretcher, his blood leaving a dark trail across the frozen ground. That left Soderman with an M9 bazooka, 4 rockets, and a foxhole that suddenly felt very small. The M9 weighed 6.75 kilograms unloaded. Each M6A3 rocket weighed 1.5 kilograms and measured 55 centimeters in length. The shaped charge warhead could penetrate approximately 100 millimeters of armor at optimal angles and close range. Soderman had been issued 4 rockets. He was facing 5 Panther tanks. The mathematics were not encouraging. The 2nd Infantry Division had arrived at the twin villages of Crinkelt and Rocherath only hours before the German offensive began. They were supposed to be resting. They were supposed to be recovering from the brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest that had bled the division white over the previous weeks. 3,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in a forest the survivors called the Death Factory. Instead of rest, they found themselves directly in the path of the largest German offensive since 1940. The Wehrmacht had massed 200,000 men and nearly 600 tanks for Operation Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's desperate gamble to split the Allied armies, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force a negotiated peace in the West. The attack had begun before dawn on December 16th, with the largest artillery bombardment American troops had experienced since the First World War. 1,600 guns had opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. Telephone lines were cut. Communications collapsed. Units found themselves fighting blind. Now the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend was pushing through the Ardennes with orders to break through at all costs. The division fielded 37 Panther tanks and 41 Panzer Mark IVs among its armored strength. Their crews were veterans of the Normandy fighting, hardened by months of combat against Allied armor and air power. They had been promised that this offensive would turn the tide of the war. The twin villages stood directly in their path. If the Germans could punch through Crinkelt and Rocherath, they would have a clear run to the Meuse River crossings. The entire northern shoulder of what newspapers would soon call the Battle of the Bulge depended on holding these 2 tiny Belgian farming communities. The problem was that American infantry had almost nothing that could stop a Panther tank from the front. The Panther weighed 45 tons. Its frontal glacis plate was 80 millimeters of hardened steel, sloped at 55 degrees. That slope meant any shell striking the front face had to penetrate the equivalent of 140 millimeters of vertical armor. The side hull armor was 40 to 50 millimeters. The rear was 40 millimeters. The turret front was 110 millimeters with a curved gun mantlet. American tank destroyers struggled to penetrate the frontal armor at close range. The standard infantry anti-tank weapon, the M9 Bazooka, fired a 60-millimeter rocket that could punch through perhaps 100 millimeters under ideal conditions. Against the Panther's front, it was effectively useless. Against the sides or rear, it could kill. But getting a side or rear shot meant letting the tank pass your position or somehow flanking it during an engagement. Neither option seemed particularly survivable. General George Patton had issued guidance that bazooka teams should engage tanks only at ranges under 30 yards. Any further and the rocket's accuracy dropped dramatically. The shaped charge warhead needed to strike at close to perpendicular angles to achieve maximum penetration. A glancing blow would deflect harmlessly off the armor. The officers had explained all of this to the bazooka teams. They had shown them diagrams. They had emphasized that frontal engagements against heavy tanks were suicide. One captain in the 9th Infantry Regiment had called the bazooka a last resort weapon, something you used when you had no other choice and probably would not survive anyway. The men had laughed nervously at that. No one was laughing now. Soderman had listened to the briefings. He had nodded at the diagrams. He understood the mathematics of armor penetration as well as any infantryman could. But mathematics did not account for what a man might do when 5 Panther tanks were rolling toward his position, and there was no one else to stop them. William Adolph Soderman had been born in West Haven, Connecticut on March 20th, 1912. His parents were Swedish immigrants who had come to America seeking work in the manufacturing plants that lined the Connecticut coast. His father found employment in a brass factory. His mother took in laundry. They raised William and his siblings in a small house 3 blocks from the water, close enough to smell the salt air on summer evenings. Soderman left school after the 8th grade to help support the family. He apprenticed as a butcher at 14, learning to break down carcasses with the methodical efficiency that the trade demanded. A side of beef weighed roughly 300 kilograms. Breaking it down into retail cuts required strength, precision, and the ability to work for hours in cold rooms without complaint. Soderman had all 3 qualities. By 1941, he had his own counter at a grocery store in West Haven. He was 29 years old, unmarried, and earning enough to send money home to his aging parents. His employer valued him. His customers trusted his recommendations. He had built a small but stable life in a working-class town where stability was hard to find. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, Soderman was technically old enough to avoid the draft. Men over 38 were initially exempt, and even younger men with essential civilian jobs could often secure deferments. A skilled butcher during wartime rationing might have argued that his work feeding the home front was vital to the war effort. Meat was scarce. Experienced butchers were needed. Soderman enlisted anyway. He reported for basic training in 1943 at the age of 31, nearly a decade older than most of the other recruits. The drill sergeants called him Pop and Old Man. The younger soldiers asked if he was sure he could keep up. Some wondered aloud why a man his age would volunteer for infantry duty when he could have stayed home cutting steaks. Soderman said nothing. He completed every march. He qualified expert with the M1 rifle. He learned to fire the bazooka, to dig foxholes that could survive artillery, to move through terrain without being seen. He shipped out to Europe with the 2nd Infantry Division in the summer of 1944 and landed at Normandy 6 weeks after D-Day. By December, Soderman had survived the nightmare of the Hurtgen Forest, where his division had lost over 5,000 men fighting through dense woodland against entrenched German defenders. The forest floor was carpeted with pine needles that muffled footsteps. The trees burst into shrapnel when artillery shells hit them. Men died from wounds that would have been survivable in open terrain, simply because the fragments came from above as well as from the sides. He had seen what artillery could do to human bodies. He had learned that survival often depended less on courage than on simple luck, being in the right foxhole when the shells came down. Standing 2 feet to the left instead of 2 feet to the right, decisions that meant nothing at the time but meant everything afterward. Now he was watching 5 Panther tanks approach through the gathering darkness, and luck seemed to have abandoned him entirely. The lead Panther was perhaps 200 yards away when Soderman made his decision. He could stay in his foxhole and let them pass, hope they did not spot him, pray that someone else would deal with them further down the road. The training said that was the smart play. Let the tanks go by, live to fight another day, or he could stand up. If you want to see what one man with a bazooka could do against 5 of Germany's deadliest tanks, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this. And please subscribe if you have not already. Back to Soderman. At 6:51, the lead Panther reached the 100-yard mark. Soderman could see the tank commander standing in the turret hatch, scanning the roadside with binoculars. The man wore the black uniform of the Panzer troops, his cap tilted against the cold wind. Behind him, the other 4 Panthers maintained their column formation, each one 20 yards behind the next. They were advancing cautiously but steadily, confident that no serious opposition remained between them and the village. Soderman raised himself out of the foxhole. He planted his feet on the frozen earth. He lifted the M9 bazooka to his shoulder. The weapon felt heavier than it had during training. The cold had seeped into his fingers, despite the wool gloves. He could feel his heart pounding against his ribs. At 6:52, the lead Panther was 70 yards away. The tank commander had not seen him yet. The man was looking toward the village, toward whatever lay ahead. Not at the single American soldier standing in the open with a tube on his shoulder. Soderman aimed for the junction between the hull and turret, the turret ring. One of the few vulnerable points on the Panther's front aspect, where the rotating turret met the fixed hull and created a narrow gap in the armor protection. It was a shot that required precision at any range. At 70 yards in fading light, it was nearly impossible. He fired. The rocket left the tube with a rush of flame and exhaust that temporarily blinded him. He felt the backblast wash over the frozen ground behind him. 1.5 seconds. He heard the impact before he could see it. A metallic crack followed by a secondary explosion as the shaped charge detonated against the tank's armor. When his vision cleared, the lead Panther was burning. Flames poured from the turret ring where his rocket had struck. The shaped charge had penetrated the gap and ignited something inside. Ammunition. Fuel. It did not matter. The commander who had been standing in the hatch was gone, either dead or thrown clear by the explosion. The tank slewed sideways and stopped, blocking half the road. At 6:53, Soderman was already reaching for another rocket when the remaining 4 Panthers opened fire. Machine gun rounds tore up the earth around his Foxhole. Tracers screamed overhead, bright red lines against the darkening sky. The tanks began maneuvering, trying to push past their burning comrade. One of them fired its main gun, the 75mm shell, exploding 20 yards to his left and showering him with frozen dirt. The pressure waves slammed against his chest. He could not reload under this fire. The M9 bazooka required the gunner to open the breech, insert the rocket, connect the ignition wire, close the breech, and aim. A process that took 8 to 10 seconds for a trained operator. 8 to 10 seconds of standing exposed while 4 tank crews tried to kill him. Soderman pressed himself into the bottom of his Foxhole as the Panthers pushed past. 1, then 2, then 3, then 4. He could feel the vibration of their tracks through the frozen ground. The earth shook with each passing tank. He heard the commanders shouting to each other in German, their voices harsh and urgent. He smelled diesel exhaust and the acrid stench of burning flesh and metal from the one he had killed. At 7:04, the last Panther disappeared into the darkness toward Rocherath. Soderman lay in his Foxhole, breathing hard, his hands shaking from adrenaline and cold. He had stopped 1 tank. 4 had gotten through. He did not know if that counted as success or failure. He did not sleep that night. German artillery continued to fall on the American positions throughout the hours of darkness. Mortar rounds walked back and forth across the crossroads. Machine gun fire crackled from multiple directions as German infantry probed the perimeter. Soderman stayed in his Foxhole, bazooka loaded, waiting. At approximately 2300 hours, a runner brought him more rockets. 4 more. The man was 19 years old and terrified, his eyes wide in the darkness. He did not stay to help. He had other positions to supply, other men waiting alone in other Foxholes along the line. Soderman now had 5 rockets total. He had already proven he could kill a Panther with 1 shot. The question was whether he would get the chance. Dawn came gray and cold on December 18th. Fog hung over the crossroads, limiting visibility to perhaps 100 yards. The temperature had dropped below -5 degrees Celsius during the night. Frost covered everything. Soderman's fingers were numb despite his gloves. At 07:12, he heard the tanks. That same grinding of tracks on frozen earth. That same rumble of 45-ton machines moving through the murk. A sound that had become the most terrifying thing he knew. 5 more Panthers emerged from the fog. Different tanks this time, approaching from a different angle, but the same threat. Same sloped armor, same long-barreled guns, Same crews. Who would kill him if they got the chance? 5 against 1. Soderman against the 12th SS Panzer Division. This time he did not wait in his foxhole. He could see that the tanks would pass his position at an angle that offered no clear shot at their vulnerable flanks. If he stayed where he was, they would roll past unmolested, just as 4 of them had done the night before. Soderman grabbed his bazooka and began running. He sprinted along a drainage ditch that paralleled the road, keeping low, moving faster than he had moved since basic training. The fog provided cover. The noise of the tank engines masked his footsteps. His breath came in ragged gasps that formed clouds in the frozen air. He reached a point ahead of the lead Panther and threw himself flat in the ditch, bazooka already at his shoulder. At 07:19, the lead tank emerged from the fog 40 yards away. Soderman could see the driver's vision slit, the spare track links welded to the front glacis for extra protection, the commander's cupola with its periscope rotating slowly. The Panther's gun was traversing toward the village, toward whatever targets the commander thought he might find there. Soderman stepped out of the ditch and into the road. He was standing directly in front of a 45-ton tank. The driver saw him immediately. Soderman saw the tank lurch as the man's instinct took over, trying to accelerate and run down the lone American who had appeared from nowhere. But acceleration in a Panther took time. The Maybach engine needed seconds to build power. Time Soderman was not going to give them. At 07:20, he fired from less than 30 yards. The rocket struck the lower front hull just above the tracks. The shaped charge detonated and punched through the thinner armor of the final drive housing. The Panther lurched, stopped, and began to smoke. The crew bailed out, scrambling from the hatches as Soderman was already running back toward the ditch. The other 4 Panthers halted. Their commanders had seen what happened to the lead tank. They had watched a single American soldier appear from the fog, destroy a Panther with one shot, and vanish again. They did not know if there were more Americans waiting in the fog. They did not know if this was an ambush. They did not know anything except that 2 of their tanks had been destroyed by something they never saw coming. At 07:23, the 4 surviving tanks reversed. They pulled back into the fog from which they had come. One man with a bazooka had stopped the second Panther attack of the morning, but Soderman was not finished. German infantry had been following behind the tanks, and now they advanced on foot toward the Crossroads. Soderman could see them moving through the fog in squad-sized groups, their gray uniforms blending with the mist. He had 3 rockets left. Infantry were not tanks, but a bazooka round did not discriminate. The shaped charge warhead would kill men as effectively as it killed machines. At 07:31, he fired his 3rd rocket into a group of German soldiers near a stone wall. The explosion scattered bodies across the frozen ground. He fired his 4th rocket at another group crossing an open field. More bodies. The German advance faltered as men dove for cover, uncertain where the fire was coming from. Soderman had 1 rocket left. He was loading it into the bazooka when he heard the tracks again. At 07:42, a 3rd Panther was approaching from yet another direction. The Germans had been probing the American lines all morning, and this tank had found a gap. It was rolling toward the Crossroads with its machine guns firing, trying to suppress any defenders who might be waiting. Soderman did not have a good shot. The tank was approaching at an angle that showed mostly frontal armor. The mathematics said he could not penetrate it. The training said he should let it pass and hope for a better opportunity. Soderman ran toward the tank. He crossed 30 yards of open ground with machine gun rounds kicking up dirt around his boots. Bullets cracked past his ears. He felt the wind of one passing his face. He reached a position on the Panther's flank just as the tank commander spotted him and began traversing the turret. The coaxial machine gun swung toward him. At 07:44, Soderman fired his last rocket from 15 yards. The shaped charge struck the side hull just below the turret ring and penetrated cleanly. The turret stopped traversing. The Panther ground to a halt. Smoke began pouring from the engine compartment. The crew did not emerge. Soderman did not wait to see if they would. He turned to run back toward American lines when the machine gun found him. Rounds tore through his right shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the frozen ground. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, a white-hot fire that spread from his shoulder, down his arm, and across his chest. He could not feel his right hand. Blood was soaking through his jacket and dripping onto the white frost beneath him. He had no weapon. His bazooka was somewhere behind him, empty and useless now anyway. Soderman began to crawl. He dragged himself along the drainage ditch with his left arm, pulling his body through the mud and ice toward where he hoped American lines still held. German soldiers were everywhere now, advancing past the burning tanks, shouting to each other as they pushed toward the village. Some of them must have seen him crawling. None of them stopped to finish him off. Perhaps they thought he was already dead. Perhaps they had more important targets to pursue. At 08:06, medics found him collapsed in the ditch, pale from blood loss, his right arm hanging useless at his side. They loaded him onto a stretcher and carried him to the aid station, where doctors worked to stop the bleeding and save what remained of his shoulder. Behind him, 3 Panther tanks burned at the Lausdal Crossroads. 3 of Germany's finest armored vehicles, each one worth more than its weight in gold to a Wehrmacht desperate for equipment, destroyed by one man with a bazooka. The German perspective on what happened at Krinkelt and Rocherath only emerged after the war. Panther commander Willy Fischer later described the fighting in his memoir. He wrote that it was a deadly trap for the Panthers. When he reached the point in front of the church in Krinkelt, he saw the American anti-tank weapon fire at Beutelhauser's tank. He maneuvered his own Panther behind a house without knowing what would come next. The Germans had made what one historian later called a cardinal tactical sin. They had sent their Panthers down narrow village streets without infantry support, assuming their armor would intimidate the American defenders into retreat. They had not anticipated men like Soderman, who would stand in the open and fire at point-blank range. They had not anticipated infantry who refused to run. German radio intercepts from December 18th recorded confused reports from tank commanders. One transmission spoke of ghost soldiers who appeared from nowhere, fired, and vanished. Another complained that the Americans were everywhere and nowhere. A third simply reported heavy losses from unknown weapons and requested permission to withdraw. SS Oberstgruppenführer Josef Dietrich, commander of the 6th SS Panzer Army, ordered the attack on the twin villages halted on December 19th. His panzers would find another route to the Meuse. The cost of breaking through Krinkelt and Rocherath had become too high. The northern shoulder would hold. The Battle of Krinkelt and Rocherath continued for 2 more days. American infantry from the 2nd and 99th Infantry Divisions held the twin villages against repeated German assaults, buying time for reinforcements to arrive and establish a defensive line on Elsenborn Ridge. When the fighting finally ended on December 20th, the streets were littered with destroyed German armor. 21 German tanks and armored vehicles had been destroyed by bazooka fire alone at Krinkelt and Rocherath. Another 27 had been knocked out by anti-tank guns and mines. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend had suffered such catastrophic losses that its commander reported his unit combat ineffective. The northern shoulder of the Bulge had held. On October 12, 1945, President Harry S. Truman presented William Soderman with the Medal of Honor at the White House. The citation praised his unfaltering courage against overwhelming odds and noted that his actions contributed in great measure to the defense of Rocherath. Soderman returned to West Haven after the war. He went back to work as a butcher, standing behind the same counter where he had worked before Pearl Harbor. He married a woman named Florence and raised a family. He rarely spoke about what had happened at Rocherath. Neighbors knew he had won the Medal of Honor. The local newspaper had published an article when he received it. But Soderman did not display the medal in his shop or his home. He did not give speeches at Veterans Day ceremonies. He did not write memoirs or grant interviews to historians who came asking about the battle. When people asked about the war, he changed the subject. In 1966, the town of West Haven dedicated a historical marker in his honor. Soderman attended the ceremony, shook hands with local officials, and returned home without making a speech. He seemed uncomfortable with the attention. The marker stands today on Campbell Avenue, describing in modest terms what he did at that Belgian crossroads. He seemed to believe that what he had done was simply what any soldier would have done in the same circumstances. He was wrong about that. The Army knew he was wrong. That was why they had given him the Medal of Honor instead of a Bronze Star or a Silver Star. What Soderman did at Rocherath was not what any soldier would have done. It was what one extraordinary soldier did when every instinct for survival told him to stay down and let the tanks pass. 2 United States Navy vessels have been named USNS Soderman in his honor. The first served from 1950 to 1974. The second was commissioned in 2010 and remains in service today. William Adolph Soderman died on October 20th, 1980 in West Haven, Connecticut. He was 68 years old. He was buried with full military honors at Oak Grove Cemetery, the Medal of Honor ribbon pinned to his chest one final time. The Foxhole where he made his stand no longer exists. The Crossroads at Lousdale has been paved over and rebuilt. Modern houses stand where Panther tanks once burned. Belgian children play in gardens that were once killing fields. But the Belgian government has placed a memorial nearby, a simple stone marker explaining what happened on that foggy December day in 1944. Most tourists drive past without stopping. It looks like any other roadside memorial in a country filled with reminders of war. The stone does not convey the cold, the fear, or the sound of tank tracks grinding toward you in the darkness. It cannot explain what it took to stand up when every instinct said to stay down, but it is not just another memorial. It is the place where one butcher from Connecticut proved that courage could stop tanks, the place where the mathematics of armor penetration met the mathematics of human will, the place where the Germans learned that American infantry would not break no matter how many Panthers they sent down the road. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We are rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about ordinary men who did extraordinary things. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure William Soderman does not disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.